Perfect. Okay. We are live. Hi, guys, and welcome to the first live event I've decided to do. And I'm so thrilled that all of you are here and can't wait to just like get you into this world and keep you here, hopefully, because I think you'll really see the value of everything that we're going to talk about today. Um, so a couple things I was telling people who are already here, this is interactive. I have my eye on the chat. I'll do my best to keep referencing it. But absolutely anything that comes up, any questions or concerns you have, stick them in. That's what I'm here for. So let's see. Okay, perfect. Just want to make sure that nothing is blocked. You guys can see these slides okay, right? My face isn't blocking it.
It looks good.
Perfect. Okay, great. So welcome to using your cycle as a scientifically precise tool. Have you ever heard menstrual cycle and scientifically precise put together? I mean, I had never heard that before. So hopefully this is the first place that you get that education where yes, you absolutely can. What do you use it for? For everything, for health, for natural birth control, for conception, and really any other health optimization goal. This works. What I'll be exposing you to is a method that works throughout the life cycle, that works through any goal. That's really here for you to understand your body and then do the things that work best for you, no matter where you are in life or no matter what your goal is. So, with that, who the heck am I? I'm Michelle. And basically, how I got here is I'm a scientist by training. So, my background is in biology, and then I have a master's in nutrition. And ever since grad school, I've been working in biotechnology, personalized wellness, where I'm now the director of science at Inside Tracker, which is a personalized wellness platform. And despite all that privilege and that education, I was in my mid 20s and am I supposed to know something or two about fertility and if I want kids one day, what does that look like? Like I don't know if I want to be on hormonal birth control forever. I was kind of getting more exposed to the fact that maybe I wasn't. That really wasn't like the best aligned thing for me. That was my personal decision at that time. And I was like, what can I trust? There's a lot of noise out there, but not a lot of people breaking it down in a way that, did it in a way that this isn't like crunchy girl birth control. This is like a scientific diagnostic tool. And the more I dug in, the more I realized that we need to know this stat. Like we should have been taught this at puberty. There's no such thing as too soon. People who are like, I don't know if I want kids or I don't want them right now. Like that's totally fine. Like this is applicable to everyone. But when it comes to fertility, like our stats are not good. As a developed nation, 1 in 6 couples globally, so that's actually a global stat, experience infertility, and it's not getting better. Like these numbers are actually getting worse. I just saw that maybe it's closer to 1 in 5 now. 90% of women are deficient in at least one or more, but likely more, for key fertility nutrients. And 80% of maternal deaths in this country are preventable. These are just a few that absolutely like blow my mind that, this is even the state of the situation. But it's very jarring to enter into this like reproductive health space and approach the subject of fertility and be like, this just isn't supposed to go well for me. Like, no, it's not luck, it's not fate. This is informed decision making. I'm here to give it to you because there's so much personal power to take back. So, cut to like this is part of my, side passion project slash business that I've been having for the past 2 years, where I work with people basically in the education. Education is my biggest goal with everyone, but really it translates to minimizing symptoms. It translates to conceiving and doing it a lot easier than you might have. We're not dealing with problems too late. We're dealing with them while we have the luxury of time, which also just gives you a healthy body now, right? So that's probably why you're here. I yell about this stuff on the interwebs, and I'm so glad that you are. So let's dive in, shall we? What we're going to go over today, um, we're going to do a quick anatomy refresh. I'll reteach you the menstrual cycle. I'm not just going to throw up that hormone graph and like let your eyes glaze over. We're going to deeply understand it because everything I'm going to teach you falls back on biology. So you'll know at the end of this call what's normal. You'll never have to wonder, like, am I seeing something that's abnormal or is it fine? And then if it's outside of normal, like I promise you, there's a reason we can get you to normal. We'll go over your fertile signs. which drive this method I'll be talking about today of tracking your cycle. We'll go over the first steps to basically using the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool, so fixing symptoms, and then I will also give you an introduction to the charting method. So let's real quick do some male and female reproductive health 101. At a very high level, men are fertile 24/7, 365. Female fertility is only 6 days per cycle. So right off the bat, it is very clear to understand that women are infertile most of the time. We aren't taught this. We're taught have sex, get pregnant, and die. Like that's what's in our generation's brain. So it's very startling to then be exposed to the very true fact that we have a fertile window. It's only 6 days long. Men are fertile all the time, right? Which is kind of this thing that every time you have unprotected sex, you're risking a pregnancy. Like we actually know that that's not true. If only 1 week out of your cycle you are fertile, but we're the ones that have to go on birth control. So I just like to point that out because this is like a very fundamental piece of reproduction that just gets glazed over. And I want to like reintroduce the reproductive system. It's probably been a minute since sex ed. And if you had it, it probably sucked. So we're going to redo it. Riley, I didn't learn what ovulation was until, no kidding. No kidding, right? This is the stuff I'm talking about. And it's no one's fault. Like, and that's why I always talk about, I have all of this training in human biology and like nutrition, how the body works, and still had no idea about this stuff. I had to essentially do all this on my own, which was wild. But this is what we'll be focusing on today. This is what's going on in your body and what you see on the outside, right? So we'll start with your ovaries. You got two every month. So at the start of your cycle, so when your period is happening, a group of follicles are developing. Okay, and they're basically competing, and the dominant ovary is the one that gets, or the dominant follicle is the one that gets ovulated. So this is actually a cool biology fact. When the ovary spits out the egg that gets ovulated, it's actually not connected to the fallopian tube. There's this liminal space, and the fimbriae of the fallopian tube kind of suck it up and pull it in, and that's just like so fascinating about the body. It's incredible. But the egg will travel through the fallopian tube, which is where if fertilization happens, or if fertilization occurs, that's where it happens. Make its way into the uterus, where it will attempt to implant into the uterine wall. If fertilization and implantation doesn't happen, the uterine lining sheds at the end of the cycle, and that's what we get our period. So the cervix isn't just a passageway. Like we're going to be talking about the cervix a lot today. She's got a lot of jobs. So the main is the cervix produces cervical mucus during the fertile window. And that is a primary fertile sign to look for, right? And that's the only reason we have a 5 or 6 day fertile window, right? Ovulation is a 24-hour event. So the reason you have a 5 or 6 day window is because your cervical fluid is actually keeping the sperm alive, right? We have a very acidic vagina. The pH is absolutely like deathly to sperm, but introduce cervical mucus, they can stay alive, and cervix actually has little like sperm hotels that they can stay in for those 5 days that they're kept alive to attempt to fertilize an egg. So we're not skipping her today. And then of course the vagina, which goes to the outside of the body. So now we're going to do menstrual cycle 2.0, or better yet, the ovulatory cycle. And why do I say ovulatory cycle? Well, that's because ovulation is the star of the menstrual cycle. Menstruation is the effect of not having a pregnancy occur, but the whole reason that we even have a menstrual cycle to begin with is to ovulate every single cycle. So the way I like to explain the menstrual cycle to really make it stick is to think about it in two phases. We have before and after ovulation, ovulation being that like main event, the whole reason the hormones do what they do is to essentially ovulate an egg every cycle. So the first phase is our pre-ovulatory phase, aka the follicular phase. This is from day 1 of your period to the day of ovulation. So the thing about this phase is it's actually quite flexible with time. So if you have a longer cycle, than most people. Like you actually have a longer pre-ovulatory phase. This is also if you've ever been like stressed or sick or traveling and your period comes at a different time than normal. What's changing is your pre-ovulatory phase. So this actually can vary quite a bit. The post-ovulatory phase, so from the day of ovulation to the start of your next period, this is also known as your luteal phase, and it's a lot more fixed. So it's always going to be 12 to 14 days optimally. And it's really rare that this deviates. If it does become shorter than that 12 days, then that's the potential red flag. And we know that you need some progesterone support. And then we get you, all the dietary supplement lifestyle fixes for that. So this is like really good to know. And I like this. We're going to spend some time with this diagram here because I really think it explains this very well. But say we have two individuals, right? Someone with a 26-day cycle here and someone with a 32-day cycle here, they get their period on the same day. Because they got their period on the same day, and this post-ovulatory phase is quite fixed, we know they ovulated around the same time. Another thing to really point out is that the post-ovulatory phase is infertile. Once you have ovulated, the egg has left the building. Okay, pregnancy is impossible. You can only ovulate once per cycle. You can ovulate 2 eggs per cycle, but it is a one-time event, is what I'm saying. So once you confirm ovulation, there are a few ways to do that. Anything here, like you're good to go, essentially, is what I'm saying. So for the birth control people, this is really good to know. For trying to conceive, this is also really, really good to know. It's good to know for everybody, honestly. The 5 to 6 day window we see here leading up to ovulation is that fertile time. This is what you would either want to avoid unprotected sex if you're using it for birth control or target if you're trying to conceive. And as you can see, it's relatively, a small piece of the whole cycle. When we get to pre-ovulatory, this is relatively infertile. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is these pre-ovulatory days are guilty until proven innocent. This is not a court of law. Okay, so basically you need to be trained in how to look at your fertile signs to understand, is today a fertile day, yes or no, and know how to monitor that to answer that question. Because if you have a shorter pre-ovulatory phase, this includes your period. So say you bleed for 5 days and then you have a shorter cycle, so you're ovulating maybe day 14, which I'll get into is like, I'm gonna say day 13 because I try not to do the textbook perfect examples that everyone has in their heads. You ovulate on day 13, you really might not have any safe days of your pre-ovulatory phase, right? So it could be right after your period, you've entered your fertile window. So that's why knowing what signs to look for is super, super important. You can't assume in this phase. So why is day 14 bad advice? If you've heard this will make sense as to why it's not true. If you haven't heard this, good. Let me like brainwash you now with the truth. So the day 14 assumption is that everyone ovulates on day 14. Why? Because everyone thinks a perfect cycle is 28 days long. 28 days is the population average, but most people don't have a 28-day cycle. Any cycle from between 25 days to 35 days is healthy. Like that is, you can have a healthy cycle at any length within that window. So why is day 14 bad advice? Well, let's look at this example, right? Someone with a 26-day cycle or 32-day cycle, both perfectly healthy examples, come in and let's say they're both trying to conceive, right? Because this is typically the context that you hear that advice. Let's average the luteal phase and say that it's 13 days. So it's 26 minus 13. This person ovulated around day 13. If they try to conceive on day 14, it's left. And then they're devastated when their period comes. That was not a try, right? Because they ovulated already, missed the fertile window just by going off the day 14 assumption. If this person targets day 14, so what's 32 minus 13? They probably ovulate around day 19. Okay, so that puts day 14 right on the cusp of the fertile window. Since this is that like guilty until proven innocent phase, could they potentially, hit that fertile period? Maybe. right? But they would be a lot better served trying on day 17, 18, 19, right? So this is why this information becomes so valuable, and why we can't just take these like day 14 or cut your cycle in half, because as you can see, it's not cutting it in half. It's subtracting 12 to 14 days from the start of the next cycle. So there's a question. Do you know that the duration of the pre-ovulatory phase can vary? It never signals anything wrong, correct? As long as yes. So I'll answer the second part first. It's not a problem if your cycles are within that 24 to 35 day, 24 to 35 day window. That is considered optimal cycle length. So the reason why it can vary, it's a great question. Biological variation between people, really we'll see. I think it'll make more sense when we get to the next slide when we talk about what happens in the follicular phase. So Haley, let me know if this next slide answers your question. If not, we'll go deeper. But what's happening in that pre-ovulatory phase? Well, the follicular phase is when our follicles, so that's how you can remember this, are developing. So the follicles are the baby eggs. It's that group of eggs that are developing in the ovary starting day one. So while you're having your period, that new cohort of follicles are developing. Your estrogen starts rising in the pre-ovulatory phase. Pop quiz, anyone know where the estrogen is coming from? What part of our body makes said estrogen? Do not be afraid to guess.
No clue.
I love that. I also had no clue. Like, this is no shame. This is just a good way to try. It's from our ovary. So those little guys, the developing follicles, are the ones that are responsible for that rising estrogen. So I just think that that's so fun. I would have guessed, I think I guessed pituitary. Like when I was learning this stuff, I was like, yeah, the pituitary. No. Well, the pituitary is talking to your ovaries, but the ovaries themselves are making that estrogen. So the rising estrogen that you experience in the first part of your cycle can take, and Haley, this is kind of what's happening. This phase is really subject to our lifestyle. So if you're really stressed out, or if you're ill, or if you're traveling, like those things that we see our cycle deviate on, like this is really responsive to it, because it's like this is the biological process that's happening, and it's a lot more sensitive to changes that are happening externally. Whereas in that luteal phase, it's not really responsive, because this is relying on basically messaging from the body to like, okay, time to start developing. That's what this FSH is. We didn't talk about it, but it's follicle stimulating hormone. It's like, okay, guys, time to start getting ready. And it's like the estrogen could take longer. You know, if you're really stressed out, it could not hit a threshold fast enough, because that's the next step. When this estrogen level hits a certain level, it hits a certain threshold, that's a triggering event for the LH surge, luteinizing hormone. And the LH surge is a triggering event for ovulation. So it could take your body a little while to ramp up to these thresholds if it's under stress, or it could just be, you know, I'm different from you. My body does it faster or slower. That's kind of why we see this variation in the pre-ovulatory phase. I want to talk about LH for a hot sec, because if you've heard of like OPK, ovulation predictor kits, nothing wrong with these. They are sensing the threshold. Oh, totally. Great. I'm glad that that helped. They're sensing the level of LH. And basically, they're going to read positive if LH is at a certain level. Now, what that's doing, it's not confirming ovulation is going to happen. It's predicting. So Rose is very much in the name in this example. The issue with that is LH can surge multiple times per cycle. So your body could be trying to ovulate a few times, especially if you have a longer cycle. And this is where we get into the out of optimal state. So if you have like a 35, 36, 37-day cycle, and you've got maybe hallmarks of PCOS, it's very common to see LH try to surge and trigger ovulation multiple times. So if you're using just an OPK, and you're thinking, okay, this is the one I typically, if you see a positive LH reading, you ovulate in the next 24, 36 hours. I'm good, I'm done, I'm trying now. That might not have been the LH event that caused ovulation. It might have been, you know, 4, 5, 6 days later. So this is why I'll be teaching you the primary signs, whereas LH strips are secondary. There's nothing wrong with them, but they should be additive. They are not, the end all be all, and many people kind of use them as such. So we're at ovulation where the dominant follicle breaks free from the ovary and does that thing where it moves into the fallopian tube. So what's happening in the luteal phase? So really, really cool. The structure that the egg left behind within the ovary is the corpus luteum, which is why this is called your luteal phase. And that's what makes progesterone. So this is all coming from the ovary. It's very, very fascinating. What the progesterone does is it raises your basal body temperature. So if you see people, taking their temperature as a form of fertility tracking, this is why. A sustained increase in temperature is a confirmation that ovulation happened. What the progesterone also does is it dries up that fertile cervical mucus. So if fertilization doesn't occur, the progesterone levels drop off and the uterine lining sheds, and then that brings us to a start of another cycle. So what is a normal cycle supposed to look like? Well, there are 6 factors. There's 6 hallmarks to look out for when you look at your cycle. So one, we already talked about cycle length. The optimal range is between 24 and 35 days, and that they don't vary more than 8 days per cycle. So again, no such thing as a perfect like menstrual cycle. It's possible to have a 24-day cycle and then a 25, then maybe a 23, maybe a 20, like a day or two variation is completely fine and normal. If it gets too varied, so that like 8-day range, that's when we're alerted that there's something going wrong. For menstruation length and quality, period flow should last 3 to 7 days, starts out really heavy and decreases to lighter. The color at first should be a deep burgundy or like a rich wine, like a deep red color. And then the lighter flow should turn bright red, pink, or brownish. There should not be mid-cycle spotting or bleeding. Moderate to severe pain should be investigated further. And by that, I mean anything like a 3 or higher on a scale of 1 to 10. If you're taking more than 1 to 2 painkillers during your period, or it feels so much worse than like a sore muscle after a workout, those are the benchmarks I use, that is an invitation to investigate further. That is not normal. That is your body screaming, alert, alert, we need to do something about this. You shouldn't have to, I feel very strongly about that because no one told me that. And this was one that I suffered with for years. So I want everyone to know that pain, it's common, it's not normal. In the pre-ovulatory phase, things to look for that are markers of a healthy cycle are clear signs of pending ovulation. And we do this through observing cervical mucus patterns. We should start to see it at around days 10 to 23. But like we said earlier, if you have a shorter cycle, the onset of cervical mucus can start as early as day 5. For the cervical mucus pattern itself, we will go over the definition of these two things, but you'll observe a pattern of non-peak to peak cervical mucus. They're both potentially fertile, right? They're telling you you're in your fertile window. But peak, what it is it means it's more optimal for conception. You're getting closer to the event of ovulation. And then ovulation itself, you'd be amazed that there are many cycles where ovulation does not occur. And that is also an alarm bell. So in most women, we want to make sure ovulation is occurring, but it will occur on the last day of peak cervical mucus, which we'll talk about. And then the post-ovulatory phase, the luteal phase, should be between 12 to 14 days before the start of the next cycle. This will allow for healthy endometrial maturation to support implantation and sustain a pregnancy. So why is a lower or a shorter luteal phase a problem? Let's go back. Well, because 12 to 14 days is the lifespan of this guy. So the corpus luteum, the structure that that egg left behind in the ovary that's making the progesterone, lives for about 12 to 14 days. So if this isn't, producing progesterone for as long and as much as it should, that's going to spell problems with the endometrial lining, and that's going to spell, hormonal insufficiency. So that's why that's like one to look out for. I always wondered about whether the mucus is, oh, Sam, you're going to be so pleased. Cervical mucus is queen, and it's so normal. The thing that blew my mind was like discharge. It's like, oh, the vagina self-cleaning, it's discharge. Like that's just what it is. No, Like, yes, it is self-cleaning, and yes, discharge is normal, but it should come in a very clear pattern. And just paying attention to it, it's amazing. It's like, wow, this actually was coming like in a pattern. And it's not all the time. And it does, change how it looks. And when it comes to like the cell slough, vaginal cell slough, so again, it's like, yeah, self-cleaning, self-regulating, how that shows up as if you were to wipe and the toilet paper is shiny, that's cell slough. The goopy stuff is cervical mucus. Or it's like, we can get into the different types and the consistencies and like what means infection and what means cervical dysplasia. Like there is an answer for everything. It's wild. So what can be going wrong? If you're outside of any of the optimal parameters that we just talked about, those six, basically it's going to help us by looking at your cycle, identify what the root problem is. So PMS, super common. There are four types, actually. And the root cause of all of them is an imbalance of progesterone and estrogen in that late luteal phase. So you saw that the progesterone was supposed to be higher than the estrogen. Often the estrogen could be in excess, and that is causing an imbalance, and that could be causing symptoms. So these are things we'll be able to pinpoint and address through diet, lifestyle, supplementation, etc. Headaches are really common. They do coincide with menstruation 60% of the time, but they're not caused by the menstrual cycle. So again, this is related to a hormonal imbalance, a hormonal insufficiency that we'll be able to target. Severe pain, again, anything a 3 or above on that 1 to 10 pain scale, reach out. And actually, if you want a good resource, 9 out of 10 times, severe period pain is endometriosis. You can have endometriosis with a perfect period because endometriosis is not a period problem, it's an inflammation problem. So that was actually my case. And I was able to get it to remission levels just through, diet and lifestyle alone, knowing what I was looking for. It is possible because if you feel like you're dying, that can't stand, right? So we definitely want to address that. For irregular periods, cycle lengths outside, so less than 24, more than 35. If you have unexpected bleeding, breakthrough bleeding, or cycle lengths that vary drastically, that's a tap on the shoulder. And then skipping periods, so skipping just one or multiple months in a row. Again, that's not a problem down here in your reproductive organs. It's a problem with communication from the brain. So really, it's a clear sign that we need to target your nutrition and maybe your exercise. Usually, most often it's associated with undernourishing, over exercising. So there's plenty of things that we can do to address these. But what they are is if, you don't fall within the ranges here, it means there are things we can do and that you should do to get you to your healthiest state. So what are your fertile signs? Let me just check the chat. Does that mean that you could take estrogen blockers during luteal if you have severe PMS? Estrogen prior to the phase? Okay, both great questions. So you guys are talking about, if we look here, right? Luteal phase, basically what it is you're approaching your next period, you're getting these severe symptoms related to the drop in hormones here. So Haley, that could be the case. Estrogen matters the level that it's hitting at all phases of the cycle. But approaching like the PMS symptoms are right, they're this range. They're the end of your last cycle going into your period. And what you could do, not necessarily estrogen blockers, but the better thing to do is to support progesterone because we can clear estrogen a few ways, right? We could do it diet, we could do it lifestyle. Estrogen clearance is always going to be important. And that's really some like really healthy things too, like fiber, vegetables, like all the things that you hear are already good for you. So basically making sure you do that in the late luteal phase is going to be really important, but supporting your progesterone is equally important. And there are a lot of ways to do that too. So basically pulling the estrogen down and pushing the progesterone up is going to get you back into that balance, and the ride into the next period will be a lot smoother. So we want to target both hormones. Great question. All right, so fertile signs. I love this, guys, so please keep it coming. Fertile signs, what are they? They're simply the direct visible result of what your hormones are doing. They're cheat codes, right? We already talked about what your hormones are doing. So the things that you see your body do tell you, okay, is my estrogen rising? Like, which means my follicles are developing, which means I'm seeing cervical mucus now and my cervix is open. Did I ovulate? Did I see my temperature rise? Did I see the progesterone take over from that corpus luteum? And did I see essentially the cervical mucus dry up because that progesterone plugs the cervix and you shouldn't be seeing any cervical mucus, a couple days after ovulation for the rest of your cycle. So it all works together so beautifully. And they're not like these random things to remember, right? It's just this very like orchestrated kind of ballet. So I love this particular graph. I think it's wonderful. So what are they? The ones that we'll be focusing on today are cervical mucus and basal body temperature, because these are the ones that are responding directly to the estrogen and progesterone. They allow us to open and close our fertile window. What you're seeing and how you see it are the things that let us know, are you making enough of each at the right times? And essentially, now we have two data sets. So we love validation here. We have one biomarker, cervical mucus, another biomarker, basal body temperature, and we can cross-reference. So we're basically double checking, which is a wonderful feature of this method as well. And then cervical position is an optional sign. I'm not talking about it today, but it is absolutely part of the method where it's like a third data point that helps you understand where you are in your cycle. These two, they can be done with external checking. The cervical position does require internal checking. So again, it's like if it's a comfort thing or if it's an ease thing, these two are going to be your primaries. All right. So cervical mucus and why it's queen. Basically, we went over this earlier, but why is the fertile window 6 days if ovulation is a 24-hour event? It's because of the presence of cervical mucus. And what it does is it's the perfect pH for sperm to stay alive. It keeps them alive for up to 5 days as you approach ovulation. And this is super cool. It prepares them to be able to fertilize an egg through a process called capacitation. So basically, the cervical fluid itself improves sperm motility and makes it possible for them to penetrate an egg. Crazy. It's just so funny because we always hear about this like valiant sperm, that is like responsible for making a pregnancy happen. And it's like like we like gave it to you on a pillow. Do you know what I'm saying? It's wild. So the pattern of cervical mucus that is the, ideal is when hormone levels are low at the start of the cycle, it's a dry day. So this is like the symbol for no cervical mucus. As the estrogen levels rise, what you start to see is what's called non-peak. And peak and non-peak, like I said, peak is that like approaching ovulation, optimal for conception, but both are fertile. It's just simply a definition, like how do they look? So we start to see non-peak, which we'll go over. And eventually, as we approach ovulation, we get this peak egg white is really how it's commonly described. And it's true. It's clear, stretchy, lubricative cervical mucus. After ovulation, when the progesterone rises and takes over, that's what plugs up the cervix, and basically you're back to dry days. So that's your ideal, like basic cervical mucus pattern. Let me just check. And so how you check this, so in the method that I am trained in and teach, it's an external wipe. And basically there are ways to classify what you see on the toilet paper. And it's like for the finger testing, what they're doing here with the stretching, it would be just like, are you able to pick it up and stretch it? To what degree are you able to stretch it? That also helps us classify peak and non-peak. So what is the difference? Peak, by definition, clear or stretchy or lubricative, looks like an egg white, right? Again, the reason it's peak, not because it's making a peak, just because this is optimal for conception. Non-peak is simply anything else. It's not stretchy, it's not clear, and it's not lubricative. It's often like white, creamy, lotiony, pasty. You can't do that big stretch thing. Maybe it'll stretch like a little bit, but not to the extent that peak mucus can. Something is wrong on this label diagram. Can you guess what it is? So this is from the Flow app. And it's showing the difference between peak and non-peak mucus, but there's something about the way that they labeled it that not that I disagree with, that is just actually biologically incorrect. And I want to see if anyone has picked it up. It is okay if you haven't, but take a guess. Take a guess. Also, I'm low-key disappointed in the flow up for this. But what it is, it's okay, no takers. It's labeled fertile mucus here and non-fertile here. And that's not true, right? Any, actually, I think I yelled about it. All pre-ovulatory cervical mucus is potentially fertile. Why? Well, let's think back to the biology of it. If you're seeing mucus at all, it means your estrogen levels are rising. It means your cervix is open. And it means that if you were to have unprotected sex, the sperm could stay, or the sperm could stay alive. It could go up in the hotel in the cervix and await potential ovulation. I'm a flow up user. Okay, Sam, no, nothing wrong. Okay, let me say this. Nothing wrong with the flow up. Actually, most people come to me using the flow up, and that's fine. I just think that it's a wonderful way to start, but as you can see, it does miss a lot of hallmarks that you would want to be paying attention to when you're doing cycle tracking for this scientific precision, like using it as a health optimization tool, using it as birth control, using it to try to conceive. All the doctor support is, "Ooh, that's so sad." This is the thing. Doctors don't know this. Doctors are not taught this. I mean, we can get real crazy. I won't talk good on my soapbox with it today, but like even due date calculations are wrong a lot of the times because they assume you ovulate on day 14. So it's like this is just so systemic and this is so dangerous. This is why we need to like educate ourselves and educate our loved ones and educate everyone else. This is why I like yell about this stuff on the internet because it's so important. It's like we're at the point where we can't afford not to know this. It's no one's fault. This is how this was designed. It's unfortunate, but we can do a lot of things about it. So no shade, maybe a little shade to the flow up, but we got options for you, Sam. All preovulatory cervical mucus is potentially fertile. Get that in the noggin. So if you're asking yourself, is today a fertile day or not fertile day, and you saw non-peak mucus, is today a fertile day? Yes. Oh, I love this one too. More or less fertile is a fallacy, right? So you might be tempted to think, oh, I'm not that fertile today because I saw non-peak mucus. You can't be more or less pregnant. This also applies to if you don't think you produce a lot of cervical mucus. So this is really common if you've been on birth control for a long time because hormonal birth control basically stops you from making cervical mucus. So if you're on it or you're in this post-hormonal birth control transition, you might not see a lot of it. That's okay. There are things we can do to increase the quantity that you see. Now, there are people who naturally just make less than others. You know, there are women who have like globs and globs and globs, and there are women who have just like, this much. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that someone else is more fertile than you. You know, you're both equally seeing a very clear primary fertile sign. If you see it, you see it. It's a fertile day, you know? And another thing I'll say is if you're not seeing cervical fluid, that's, it's an alert, right? It doesn't fall inside that parameter optimal. You know, if you don't see anything, that's an indication that you need to, do some things that we can get you there. However, pregnancy can happen any cycle with ovulation, whether you saw mucus that cycle or not. That's really important to remember, right? We're not, we always want to like root back to the biology. So even if you don't see cervical mucus, but you then ovulated, like that, it could have happened. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's just a good thing to be cognizant of. Why cervical mucus matters no matter what your goal is, it's amazing as a health screening tool. So it's a free and monthly way to check in on your estrogen and progesterone levels. There are clear indicators. So there are certain patterns we would see that are associated with cervical dysplasia. What cervical dysplasia is abnormal cervical cell growth that can turn into cervical cancer potentially. So this is something that is amazing to know to look for so that if you have this, now you know a lot earlier, right? And there are things you can do. to attempt to reverse or minimize cervical dysplasia through lifestyle and diet. It will also help alert you to infections, STI, or bacteria, which is also really important to keep an eye on. For birth control, it'll let you know exactly when to use protection. And for conception, the opposite, it lets you know exactly when it's time to try to conceive. So, like I said, the ovulation occurs on peak day. So that's, again, the last day of your cycle that you saw peak, clear, or stretchy or lubricative egg white mucus. 80% of the time, that's when ovulation happens. Or like the 2, 3 days around it. And for that, I'll say, the only way to truly confirm the day and time that you ovulated is if you had like an ultrasound of your ovary every day. I don't know about you, I don't have that. So the next best thing is to use basal body temperature and cervical mucus. So we are using the best we can get, right? Without doing the ultrasound every day. But just so you know, like in case things don't match up perfectly, like that is why. Like the goal is to get them to see them as close as possible. They don't always have to be on the same day, like your ovulation day and peak day. But I'll show you my chart and you can see an example of that after this. So basal body temperature, this is our second primary fertile sign. And what it is it's a measure of your body's resting metabolism. And so I'm just reading this chat really. So before we basis, I wonder how an ectopic pregnancy can occur. That's a really good question. So ectopic by definition means it's not in the uterus. But if your question, let me actually ask you, are you wondering how a pregnancy at all can happen when someone is on their period? Because it can. Like there are situations where, your period is considered fertile. And that goes back to that pre-ovulatory phase. If you see cervical mucus right after your period and you were seeing it as, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, no, I meant because like in the internet, like they say even like someone has ectopic pregnancy, they can still keep having the period, so they don't know like maybe like 3 months in the ectopic pregnancy. But
Yes.
biologically, like I don't know, it doesn't really make sense to me, but I'm missing something maybe, I don't know.
No, you're not. You're not. Let's see. Let's take a look real
Thank you.
quick. No, of course. So ectopic means it's like implantation would stay in the fallopian tube, right? So if you're still having a period, it is kind of an issue because this uterus is still free, right? So you are probably not ovulating. Actually, this will answer your question. You're not ovulating if you're quote unquote pregnant, like if you're pregnant, right? But you could have breakthrough bleeding. And why you have breakthrough bleeding at all, like say you could still have a breakthrough bleed if you're not pregnant, but you didn't ovulate and you think it's a period, but you only get a true period after ovulation, right? But let's think about it. What's happening in the pre-ovulatory phase is your uterine lining is being built. So your estrogen's rising, and this is probably maybe I haven't read, maybe send me the article because maybe the context is important here, but I think this situation will help explain it more, where this is the pre-ovulatory phase, right? Let's say you don't ovulate, but you still see a bleed. Why? It's because this lining was still trying to build, right? The estrogen was still rising. Maybe we didn't get to levels where we could trigger an ovulatory event. This was an anovulatory cycle. It means ovulation didn't occur. Okay, so we don't get this progesterone here. And the progesterone is what's really making this inhabitable for a fertilized egg. But say you do see a bleed here, which is possible. And I think people call this a period, but what they're really just seeing is that attempted uterine lining shed. So this is why you can like still get a period with pregnancy. It's like, well, because the hormonal changes were still causing uterine lining to build up. Ultimately, it shed, right? And you thought it was a period, but since no ovulation event happened, it's not a true period. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. No,
So
great
there is
question.
no ovulation after the ectopic pregnancy. Yeah.
Right, 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 right.
Okay. Thanks.
Or maybe like I would have to do semi because sometimes the vagina can do some crazy things, right? Like
Yeah,
I
I mean
cannot
the
claim to see it
articles,
all.
yeah, was from not scientific articles. It was from blog articles or something. But
I
the
do.
those are also based on scientific articles. But
Yes.
sometimes can be happen like false information. So yeah.
And that's the thing, right? A lot of the information, even from scientific sources, it
Mhm.
can be wrong just because there's this lack of this foundational understanding. I mean, I've seen scientific PubMed sources that claim you can ovulate multiple times per cycle. And we know that not to be true now, but it exists, right? That literature exists. It's Wild West out here. But no, great. That's a good exercise of always going back to the biology. So when we're
Okay,
looking
thank you.
at, no, excellent. I like that. I love that. Basal body temperature. How this helps us confirm ovulation is that progesterone that the corpus luteum makes raises our metabolic rate, which is why this is very, dramatized graph, but this is, what a healthy cycle would look like, where this is pre-ovulatory, ovulation happens, and now you see a sustained rise in temperature. So the true definition of confirmed ovulation would be 3 days of elevated temperature that are higher than your previous 6 days pre-ovulation. So how does BBT help no matter what your goal? If you have consistently low temperature, it can indicate a thyroid issue. So there is an optimal range when it comes to the temperature band that we expect your BBT to be in. That does come with the method as well. Like if it's consistently on the lower side, that can indicate a thyroid issue. It's an early alert to an illness. So this has been a benefit of that I've noticed by tracking my temperature every day. Like I know I'm sick before I feel sick because of this increase in temperature. That can throw off, your charting a little bit. So we always want to note if we're feeling ill. Temperature is not perfect, and a lot of people will say it's, unreliable because it can be so susceptible to a bad night's sleep or illness or travel, and it can. But when you're doing it every day, clear patterns do emerge. And there are ways to sort of create consistency in the read where you can ignore outliers. And the method does allow for, outliers here and there. And then the benefit of having the additional fertile signs is you can cross-reference. So we're never just relying on one thing that we see. For birth control and conception, obviously this allows you to confirm ovulation, thus closing the fertile window. So if someone has low progesterone, will they perhaps not see a rise in temperature? Excellent question. If you don't see a rise in temperature, you likely did not ovulate. You can have a low progesterone and still ovulate, and you will see those things that are like a short luteal phase, right? Or prolonged cervical mucus after ovulation. And that's telling us you have progesterone, your temperature might have risen, but your cervix didn't plug up all the way that it's supposed to, right? And your corpus luteum didn't sustain itself for the 12 to 14 days if your luteal phase is only 10 days long. So if you're not seeing the temperature, if you're just looking at that and you don't see the rise, the answer is usually probably that you just did not ovulate that cycle, because any progesterone produced by the corpus luteum will increase your basal metabolic rate. Excellent question. So here's this like method that I've been talking about to you guys, and it's called the fertility awareness method. There are many, but fertility awareness in general is letting you answer the question every day, am I fertile or am I not? Right? Yes or no. What it's not the rhythm method. People hear fertility awareness and they're like crunchy, the religious like system where you're family planning. It's not that at all. It's not rhythm method thinking. We avoid rhythm method thinking to the best that we can. It's hard not to. Rhythm method thinking, what that is that's using past cycles to predict your current or future ones. That's the people that come and say, I always ovulate on day 15. Always, always, always. And it's not that I don't believe you, but you don't, right? Like, even if you have consistently, something could go like interesting with your health, and then you would say, there's no way I could be in my fertile window already. I always ovulate on this day. You cannot use past cycles to predict your current or future ones. And this is why we're being very scientific here. We're being observers. What am I seeing? What am I not? Are they fertile signs? Are they not? Am I fertile today? Yes or no? That's it, right? So there are many different kinds of fertility awareness methods. There are ones that look at cervical mucus only, symptothermal, which is the one that I teach, symptohormonal. So if you see the cool little devices that you can like pee on every day and they tell you your hormone levels, that would be symptohormonal. But symptothermal, why it's so great is in the research, it is 99.4% effective at birth control. So again, this is like scientifically supported. So what does it mean when I say symptothermal? Sympto is cervical mucus. That's the sympto that you would see. So what you need to use this method correctly, there are rules to this. So you need the ability to know the difference between a fertile day, mucus day, and a dry day, and then how to classify the mucus, right? And then thermal being the temperature. So you need the ability to consistently take temperature and note the factors that affects it. I want to quickly just note method versus user failure here because it can get conflated a lot of times when we talk about efficacy for birth control specifically. So when we have a method, we have method failure and user failure. So method failure would be like a condom breaking, right? Or pregnancy occurring with the IUD, which is really rare, but it has happened, right? And user failure would be like you not taking your birth control pill every day. Are you taking it, at different times or taking two or whatever? Whereas with the IUD, there is no user failure really because user is not a factor in the method. So when we're talking about efficacy, we really have to understand like, is it the method or is it user? And then if we are in a user heavy method, which is what the symptothermal is, it's really completely dependent on the user. The method is the rules of the method, but the efficacy comes from how we use and apply them. So when we have, again, a user-heavy method, this is why it's so important to understand what we are looking at. I think, did I read my disclaimer earlier where it's like, I'm introducing, I'm introducing you to the foundation of this, but like, if you want to learn how to do it, there is a learning curve and we would work together and I could train you in this, absolutely. But hearing this can be very exciting and empowering. But if you're, someone who's trying to use it for birth control and you don't know all the things to look for, that would result in it not being very effective for you, right? Because you wouldn't be following the method as well as you could be. So around 93% effective with typical use when we look at symptothermal method, which is equivalent to the contraceptive pill. So just introducing this is a very viable option for you in lieu of everything that's already out there that we are familiar with. Okay, I have 5 minis, so I'm going to try to I can hang, but if everyone else has to leave, no problem. This is being recorded. But I want to show you my chart because this is the fun stuff. So when we look at cervical mucus, please ignore the notation stuff. Again, it looks scary, but I promise you it's not. It's actually quite easy to get the hang of. There is a learning curve, but you'll get on it in a cycle or two. I promise. So there is a standardized way to notate what you're seeing and the consistency and the peak and the non-peak, like I said, but just pay attention to this stamp coloring right here. So what this means is you're looking at my last cycle with menstruation, and then we had dry days. The dry days are green. And then we see cervical mucus entering the stage. I was noting peak, so purple is peak and the pink is non-peak. So again, that's just, is it clear or stretchy or lubricative or is it not? And let me see, there's a couple things I could say, but I don't want to, I know we're getting close to time. Does anyone see a red flag here? If not, don't worry. Maybe just stick it in if as we go. But I did have a red flag my last cycle. There's no such thing as a perfect cycle, trust me. And I'm a nutritionist and I do all the right things, quote unquote, and I sleep and there's always something. Trust me when I say there's always something. But it's great because now I'm doing things that I will see the benefits of in my next cycle. All right, so when we're talking about ovulation, ovulation, when you're looking at cervical mucus, is 80% of the time happening on peak day, the last day you saw purple peak mucus, right? So for me, that would be day 17. That was the last day I saw this peak egg whitey mucus. And ignore the counts. This is if we're closing the fertile window, we need to wait at least 3 days before we do so, just to make sure, give the progesterone time to dry everything up and make sure, ovulation has definitely occurred. But yeah, that would be according to the cervical mucus notation ovulation day, which is very, very cool. Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Riley. No, totally. Anyone that has to drop off at 4, please feel free. I will send this out to you. When we look at temperature, okay, I think you can handle this. Basically, I love data, so I put 2 thermometer readings on this chart, same chart. I was just being nice in the last slide. I have the aura, so I was tracking the temperature that gets spit out from the natural cycles algorithm, and then I was also taking an oral basal body temperature thermometer reading every day. And the thing I want to note about the devices, they're great, right? But this isn't truly tracking basal body temperature. What this is doing is it's tracking skin temperature change, and the natural cycles algorithm is transforming it into a temperature. So you can see they trend really closely, but the aura is always like a few degrees lower because this is not like my hand is not my core body temp. So that is to be expected. Just wanted to throw that out there because a lot of these, devices and wearables claim, we're tracking a primary fertile sign. Well, it's like you're approximating it, right? Through your proprietary algorithm, which like what is it? So this is why I make sure to track my basal body temperature as well. But did I ovulate? Do we see a sustained thermal shift? Yes. And the day before we saw an elevated temperature sustain was day 16, right? So that would make, if we're looking at just temperature, that would make my ovulation day 16. So if you remember, the cervical mucus was day 17, thermal shift happened before day 16. So they're very close, right? But again, like I said, they're not going to match up perfectly all the time because truly the only way to like say when you ovulated is if you're taking an ultrasound of your ovary, which of course we don't have. So next best thing, day 16, 17. I'm going to go with day 16 because that is the day before the temperature rise this cycle. Okay, analyzing your cycle. My red flag. Oh yeah, let me give it to you. I only had an 11-day luteal phase. And this pattern of non-peak cervical mucus still after ovulation ideally shouldn't be there, right? Because the progesterone should have closed up and plugged the cervix, meaning no mucus is coming through. So what does this mean? This means I need to start doing some things that support progesterone. That is always going to be like step one. Absolutely, you can do things that basically help metabolize estrogen. Do that too. And then the beauty of this is it's if you like the validation, you should be able to see the results of your efforts within a couple cycles, which is really, really fun. So analyzing. So basically now that we can understand what's going on in your body, we can start making the adjustments for the things going haywire. So I put a few of the red flags here. So we want to see, a long luteal phase, 12 to 14 days. We want to see the healthy cervical mucus patterns. And if we don't, we start being able to pinpoint where you need that support to really be laser precise to do the things that get you to those optimal levels for your next few cycles. Um, and then this is, I won't go too much into it. I think we did touch on a lot of it. But it just goes to show that you might think you're ovulating and you do a couple rounds and you realize you're not, right? You may think you have healthy luteal phase and then you track it and it's only 10 days, right? This stuff is really, really common and there's always something to do to support our cycle, right? So, oh, this is good. So I wanted to stick this in because I just talked for what, an hour about the menstrual cycle and I didn't mention cycle syncing once. And you're probably like, why isn't this girl talking about it? This is what I see on social media, 80% of the time when we're talking about, you know, taking charge of your menstrual cycle. And maximum of 14 days, could be shorter. So 12 to 14, it should never be less than 12 days, the corpus luteum life cycle. And yep, that's the healthy parameter. And anything less than that 12 days is an alert that we need to support progesterone. Great question.
Oh, okay. You said like 11 days. That's why you need to support for just
Yeah,
one.
exactly. So mine
Okay.
was 11.
Okay.
So mine
Okay.
was shorter than 12. Exactly. So even though you're like, hey, that's pretty close, it should be. It should be 12 to
Okay.
14. Yeah. Um, so for cycle syncing, what I'll say about this briefly on my soapbox is what I think it's amazing for is getting into this world. It was one of the things that pulled me in when you're like, oh my God, I'm a very cyclical being who can now organize my life around, these fluctuating hormones and use it to my advantage. And like, yes, you absolutely can, right? But I see it as a bell curve where it's like this is the entry, and where you should be spending most of your time is everything we just talked about. Why? Because if you truly want to optimize your patterns, you need to know where you are in your menstrual cycle, right? And you can't just screenshot something that looked cool that was like days 1 through 7, rest and stretching, days 7 through 14, hit exercises, days 14 through 28, strength training. That's based on a cookie cutter 28-day protocol. And as we know, that might not be you. So if you're doing things, based on this, when everyone thinks you should be ovulating, when everyone thinks you're in your luteal phase, but you're actually still in your fertile window, the things that you're doing according to that guidance isn't actually going to be optimal for you, right? So I love it for energy management. Like even today, I plan this in accordance with when estrogen levels are rising for me. But only if it's based on your menstrual cycle and instead of the cookie cutter protocol. And then, once you spend time here knowing your biology and where you are, then you can bring it back in, right? You're like, okay, I am in my luteal phase. I'm going to do XYZ, which is great. So I see it on like either ends, but where we should be spending the majority of our time is here. What I don't love about it is it can be very prescriptive to the point of restricting for certain efforts. And by that, I mean, looking at the research, unfortunately, I kind of wanted this to be true, but unfortunately, it's still emerging or inconclusive that, strength training in your luteal phase doesn't help you grow muscle faster or better than strength training in your follicular phase. HIIT training in your ovulation window is not helping you lose fat more than HIIT training in your luteal phase. So do you see what I'm saying? It's actually unfortunately not very supported that you should restrict certain things to certain phases. Yes, you could feel better due to a surging hormone level in certain parts of your cycle, but where that really comes down to is you experimenting. Like understand where you are, understand, okay, this workout I did today, I felt great. That's your version of cycle syncing. This workout I did, I felt terrible. Okay, maybe try it in a different phase then and like see if that's better. The same thing goes for nutrition. A lot of the times I'll see, like root vegetables in your luteal phase because they're estrogen clearing. And like, yes, that's amazing. But there's no reason to not eat root vegetables all month long. So if it's in any way cutting out an activity or a food or something that, you really could get by doing and that feels fine to you to do at any point because you think it's not optimized for your cycle, then that's where I have kind of an issue with it. But what I'll always preach is know yourself, know your body, know where you're at, and then from there you can create your own optimized like cycle syncing, which is really fun. And I actually do advocate for it. Um, but the most important thing is knowing your own body. But everyone has to go. Amazing. Thank you so much for coming. Have I tracked activity in each of my phases and found patterns? Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would say, I mean, I wouldn't say the stuff that you see is terribly wrong. So I definitely notice the closer I get to starting my period, so before the next cycle, it's harder for me to do hard workouts. A lot of it's just the energy management, like I said, like that's the crux of it for me is the energy. So for me, I'm very able to like do harder things for longer when I have this like rise in estrogen approaching ovulation, like that tracks, right? But that's because I know when I'm ovulating. I'm not saying day 14, I'm going to do a HIIT workout because that's when I think I should be. That's really the distinction there. And then found patterns. I don't not work out during my period, but like it is better for me to do low impact for sure. And I know people that have PR'd like with strength training on their period, right? So it's not to say that that's for everyone, but it's very individual and knowing your deal is definitely will always be the best policy. And that was it. No, thank you all so much for your questions. I know we're over. I appreciate everyone who stuck around, so I won't keep you any longer. If you do have questions, though, email me, message me. I do try to host Q&As, like live ones, very regularly, like at least once a month or so. So stay tuned for the next one, and then you could submit there and we can hang out and talk. But thank you. Thank you everyone for coming and for giving me an hour of your Friday. And be in touch. Be in touch. This was so much fun.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
guys. Thank you.